A few people are trickling in, but I wanted to start us off, especially by introducing Laura Ronsky from SurveyMonkey. Laura is the research, I'm going to say it wrong, research science manager at SurveyMonkey. And we really want to thank you, Laura, for putting such energy and priority into this project.
Thank you so much, Janelle. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We are super excited to share out this data with everyone. I think it's been a great project to have that Karthik and Janelle kicked off a few weeks ago. My name is Laura Ronsky. I'm a research science manager at SurveyMonkey. SurveyMonkey has done a lot of polling over the past several years on race and ethnicity issues. And this particular project is really important to us. I think it's been, thank you first of all to the AAPI data team for their expertise for driving this project. It's been inspiring to see it come together, particularly so quickly. And SurveyMonkey is really proud to be a part of bringing these data to light. I think what's unique about this project, and we can get into that in a little bit, is just the scale that we were able to provide here. We received more than 16,000 responses in less than a week with an oversample of the Asian American Pacific Islander population in the US. And so what I think we'll be able to do in our time today, and what you can dig into the data a little bit more on your own to explore, is all those differences. We often group Asians into an other category, and which, you know, from right off the bat, we can see in this data that the experiences that this community is experiencing every day really do, there's some things that tie everyone together, but it's important to look at the different characteristics for each subgroup as well. And so we're able to do that with this data set in a way that oftentimes is overlooked, or oftentimes just isn't possible with a smaller scale survey. I think I'll open it up for Janelle and Karthik to add in their feedback and initial thoughts and introduce the other panelists.
Great, thank you, Laura. Well, I think what I'll just do on behalf of the API data team is just to express my deep gratitude to the SurveyMonkey team, and that goes from the senior leadership all the way down. We were just really inspired. I'll say that when we reached out, it was you know, it was the day after the killings in Atlanta, and I remember having a very early morning phone call with Janelle, and we were talking about the need to have timely data on this, and we're racking our brains in terms of, you know, how we could do this quickly. And we were just very fortunate for the team at SurveyMonkey, who had already reached out about a month prior to say that we should start exploring some collaboration possibilities. And so just deep gratitude to your team, from John Cohen, who's the, what's his title? He's like the senior research officer.
Yeah, he's our chief research officer. Yeah. And Antoine Andrews is our fresh in the job, brand new chief diversity and inclusion officer. So on our side, we got a lot of involvement internally within SurveyMonkey. So we involved our employee research groups to help out with the questionnaire. So I think there's a wealth of data here. So
absolutely, and I just want to highlight that with you know, many of the questions here are repeats from prior surveys we've done, but there are some new questions that Janelle and I we learned and really valued the new questions that were added. You know, when we're in the Google Doc, we would just see these different folks from the SurveyMonkey team just throwing things, commenting on each other. It was really it was a true collaboration. We're really grateful for that. So with that, Janelle, if you could share your screen, and I'll just highlight some of the major findings in the survey.
And I will just introduce the other panelists. So Karthik Ramakrishnan from AAPI Data, the founder and director of AAPI Data, will be presenting some of the key findings. And then he will be followed by a community commentary by Manju Kulkarni, Executive Director of AP3Con. Then Niambi Carter from Howard University, and I will have a short discussion on the findings. I'm Janelle Wong, and I'm a senior researcher at AAPI Data. And then finally, we will have Drishti Pillai here Drishti is the research manager at the National Asian Pacific American, sorry, I'm in the wrong slide, the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum, NAPAW, who has been incredibly involved in commenting on the tragedies over the last few weeks, and also has been advocating for Asian Americans throughout the pandemic and prior. So Karthik, with that, I'll move it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Janelle. So in terms of background for this study, this was conducted online from March 18th through the 26th of 2021, and the total sample is 16,336 adults, ages 18 and over. This includes a little over 2,000 respondents who self-identify as Asian or Asian American in any of those detailed categories, as well as those who identify as Native Hawaiian. Or their estimate for the full sample is plus or minus 1.5, and for the subgroups, it's plus or minus 3.5 percentage points. The data have been weighted for age, race, sex, education, citizenship status, and geography using the Census Bureau's American Community Survey. Next slide. So some key findings. One is that about 1 out of every 4, okay, there was a slide that we skipped, my apologies. One thing we should note, whenever possible at AAPI Data and the National Asian American Survey, we aim to conduct interviews in English as well as in Asian languages, at the very least in Chinese, Vietnamese, and Korean. That is not something that we had the luxury of time to be able to do here. So we did this in English only. We do note some potential biases that might exist. So for instance, when we looked at the National Asian American Survey in 2016, that was a telephone survey that had English as well as Asian language respondents. The English language respondents in that survey were likely to report higher levels of hate crimes and discrimination than those who took it in an Asian language. So if there's any concern that what we're presenting here are underreports of incidents, it's very unlikely. If anything, it's likely an overreport of discrimination, because generally we find that the native-born and English-dominant respondents are more likely to name things as discrimination and to self-report experiences with discrimination. That said, the majority of the Asian American sample reported speaking a language other than English in their homes. Next slide. So some key findings from the study. So the top lines, 1 out of every 4 Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. We actually have the data separate for Asian Americans as well as Native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders. And they're roughly the same. It's 27% for Asian Americans, 24% for Pacific Islanders. It's within the margin of error. When we look more closely at 2021, 1 out of every 10 Asian Americans and Pacific Islander adults, and it is the same for both populations, have experienced hate crimes and hate incidents. And these rates are higher than the national average of 6%. Next slide. Other key findings, so part of what is likely driving this increase in hate incidents for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in particular is this presumed foreigner status. As we'll show later on, when it comes to other racial groups, there are likely other stereotypes that are driving hate incidents, which are also similarly prevalent for other communities of color. But for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, it is that presumed foreigner status, which is reflected in this question, in people saying yes to having people asking where you're from, assuming that it's not from the United States. Also being encouraged to Americanize or whiten your name. We also find that Pacific Islanders and Asian Americans are also more likely than the national average and non-Hispanic whites to have people intentionally mispronounce their name. Next slide. Now, as I said before, in 2021, what our data show are that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are similar to other communities of color, including Native Americans and Black respondents, as well as Latino respondents. So Latino respondents, their experiences with hate incidents is a little bit lower at 7%, but it's within that margin of error when you look at the Asian American and Pacific Islander populations. Asian Americans overall, however, note lower levels of discrimination in other venues, including housing. the criminal justice system, employment, and education when compared to Black respondents and other non-white groups. Next slide. So just to go into these in detail, you can find these on our blog, as well as on the blog of SurveyMonkey that has these findings in greater detail. You also can play around with the data via SurveyMonkey in partnership with Tableau. So first, the question of, have you ever been a victim of a hate crime? That is, and we defined this in our study, and this replicates a question that we asked in the National Asian American Survey in 2016. And we define it as, have you ever had someone verbally or physically abuse you or damage your property specifically because of your race or ethnicity? If they answered yes to that question, they were then asked 3 additional questions on whether they experienced hate crimes or hate incidents before the coronavirus pandemic in 2020, last year in 2020, and this year in 2021. So focusing on the Asian American and Pacific Islander population, 27% say that they have indeed experienced it. And for Pacific Islanders, it's 24%. Getting closer to 2020 after the onset of COVID, 12% for Asian American adults, 10% and then 10% each for both groups in 2021. Just as a point of reference, there are about 18 million Asian American and Pacific Islander adults in the United States. So that gives you a sense of the scale of this problem as it stands right now. Next slide. Now, when you look across racial groups in that overall question, we see that the average is 22% overall. It is highest among multiracial and Black respondents in the survey. And then you have Asian Americans and Latinos below that, and Native Americans and Pacific Islanders all within that margin of error. And then you have white respondents, 17% of whom say yes to that question. In terms of 2021, what you see is a kind of equalization across groups. So the big finding here is that when you look at Native American, Pacific Islander, Asian American, multiracial, and Black populations, all of them have experienced similar rates of hate crimes or hate incidents. Next slide. Now, beyond actual experiences, we also asked about worry about different issues, including being a victim of a hate crime. We see that the highest level of worry is among Black respondents, and then followed by Pacific Islanders and Asian Americans, and then trailing off after that. Now, when it comes to level of comfort in terms of reporting hate crimes to law enforcement authorities, one of the things we'll talk about more in the discussion with community partners is not only what the self-reported experience in a survey context look like, but what reluctance to report might do in terms of the gap between experiencing these various acts and reporting it either to community hotlines or to law enforcement authorities. When it comes to law enforcement authorities, just 1 second, Janelle, to the previous slide, note that white respondents show the greatest level of comfort, highest to say that they'd be very comfortable, then it goes down from there. Asian Americans are the lowest. Only 30% of Asian American adults say that they would feel very comfortable reporting a hate crime to law enforcement authorities. Next slide. Now, there are different reasons for that. Some of them include bringing unwanted attention to themselves or their families. Asian Americans and Latinos are similar here. Next slide. There's also the fear of being attacked again. And here you see among Asian Americans, Latino, Black, and Pacific Islander individuals all expressing similar levels of concern that they might get attacked again if they report a hate crime. Next slide. We also see significant variation in terms of level of confidence over whether justice will be served. So Asian Americans are among the most skeptical that if they report hate crimes, that justice will be served. Next slide. Now, in terms of everyday stereotypes that might be fueling this, go ahead, Janelle. One, or first set of factors relate to the perpetual foreigner stereotype among Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. What's notable here is that even though most Pacific Islanders are born in the United States, you do have Pacific Islander immigrant populations. They are treated as if they are foreigners, both with respect to this question, as well as the question about asking where they're really from, presuming that they're not from the United States. Next slide. We also see that Pacific Islanders are among those most likely to have their name intentionally mispronounced. And we also see high levels among Latino, Black, and Asian American populations. Next slide. Here's the finding that we had in terms of people asking where you're from, assuming that you're not from the United States. So Asian Americans are at the highest here at about 2/3, and about a majority of Pacific Islanders and Latinos also report that they get asked where they're from, assuming that they're not from the United States. Next slide. In terms of acting as if you don't speak English, we find that Pacific Islanders, Latino, and Asian Americans all rank very high here. And note that this is a survey that's taken in English, right? So this is individuals who are English dominant who get this treatment where people act as if they don't speak English. Next slide. And then there are other sets of stereotypes that have arguably even more serious consequences. So the stereotype of Black criminality remains strong. So if people acted as if they're afraid of you is extremely high among Black respondents who report that people have acted that way, and it's low among Asian American and white populations. Next slide. Whether people act as if you're dishonest. By the way, when people act as if they're afraid of you, Pacific Islanders also ranked high on that score, and that's true here as well. Black and Pacific Islander populations rank high on reporting that people have acted as if they are dishonest, whereas Asian American and white populations rank pretty low on this score. Next slide. When it comes to acts of discrimination, we find some significant variations. So going beyond the hate crime data, when you look at respondents reporting that they've been unfairly stopped, searched, questioned, physically threatened, or abused by the police, this is data that's been replicated from the 2016 National Asian American Survey. We find that Black respondents are the highest to report yes to that question, followed by multiracial and Native American and Pacific Islander population, and then it tails off. Notably, Asian Americans have reported the least. Now, this is aggregated. When you go to the website, you will see disaggregation across the largest Asian American groups. You also see disaggregation by gender and by age, and you do see variation in the Asian category on those measures. Next slide. Now, housing discrimination, this is the way we asked it in the NAS 2016 as well. Have you ever been unfairly prevented from moving into a neighborhood because a landlord or a realtor refused to sell or rent you or a house or apartment? We see Black and Pacific Islander populations ranking highest here, Native American and Latino populations in the middle, and then Asian American white populations the least likely to report this kind of housing discrimination. We also have data on whether respondents have been unfairly denied a promotion. And again, we see some significant variation with Black and Native American populations at the top, and white and Asian American populations towards the bottom. We also have findings in terms of whether people have been discouraged or encouraged to continue their education. Here we see that Pacific Islanders are at the top in terms of being unfairly discouraged by a teacher or advisor from continuing their education. Asian Americans are near the bottom. Next slide. Okay, so that's what I have in terms of my commentary. I'm gonna now turn it over to Manju Kulkarni, who will provide some additional commentary.
Thanks so much, Karthik, and thank you and Janelle and AAPI Data for inviting me to join you all today. And I should just say at the outset, I'm a big fan of AAPI Data and have been following their work for quite a long time, as well as the National Asian American Survey, which is so important in terms of us really understanding the attitudes, perceptions, and experiences of our AAPI communities. Before I start, I want to just thank a couple of the folks and appreciate their attendance today, including two of our board members, Tavai Samuelu, who's vice president of our board, and Linda Akutagawa, who is a member of at large of the AppCon board of directors, and know that there are several others, including Daphne, Manisha, Ann, and Deepa, who are on today, who are colleagues and friends. So in terms of my first reactions, let me say that the data offered here today aligns very closely with what we are seeing at Stop AAPI Hate. And this is a collaborative that AppCon launched a year ago with Chinese for Affirmative Action and San Francisco State University. We began to see an emerging trend in February of 2020 of incidents against Asian American community members, really around COVID-19 and hate that was directed toward us. So we launched our online reporting center, and very quickly, within a few weeks, got several hundred incident reports. So as of end of February, we have over just under actually 4,000 from all 50 states in the District of Columbia. So my first reaction is when I see that 27% of our community members have experienced something in their lifetimes, that's obviously very concerning. And 10% just in 2020, and the same numbers in 2021. I think this follows what we've also seen from other survey outlets, including the California Health Interview Survey, which found it was about 7% in California. Pew, of course, has reported similarly high numbers, as well as the Center for Integrity around an Ipsos poll. So that's an interesting finding. One thing that I think we want to look more into is, of course, the Pacific Islander numbers. So at Stop AAPI Hate, we've gotten relatively low numbers, but we have received incident reports and are in conversation with leaders in the PI community around what's going on, what's happening, what we have seen in terms of the handful of cases we've received is that they're very similar to what Asian Americans are reporting. Also, in terms of even the comments that are made in those hate incidents, essentially go back to your country, you're a COVID carrier, you're dirty, you're filthy, don't speak your language, et cetera, which are sadly very common among the reports that we've received. A second point or reaction that I have is around the question of hate crime. So what we are looking at Stop AAPI Hate is the differentiation of hate incidents and hate crimes. And I think one thing I would love to explore moving further is whether people understand that distinction, and if it enables us to really get to the heart of the problem. With my former civil rights attorney hat on, I will say that, of course, there are significant differences, and they help us understand too what solutions are moving forward. So certainly in the category of physical attacks, typically battery, rape, homicide, those are in fact crimes with an underlying criminal element. Assault is sometimes, not always, and actually in many cases, verbal attacks are not in any way criminalized because of our free speech laws. But when in conjunction with civil rights violations like workplace discrimination, discrimination in housing, as well as in public accommodations, that's grocery stores, pharmacies, big box retail, those are civil violations. And so again, as we look at solutions moving forward, we want to know and better understand what people think when they hear the term hate crime, and then also better educate them as to the distinctions, so that when we look to solutions, we get at the right solutions, knowing that law enforcement is not, in fact, the sole solution in this particular case. I will tell you at Stop AAPI Hate, 90% of the incidents we've received do not involve an underlying criminal incident element whatsoever. And so I think for us, we are really looking at some of those alternatives to, of course, law enforcement and mass incarceration. A few other quick points. I love the fact that this is opening up the dialogue around, ways in which people have been otherized. So, not only on your survey, but also we see on Twitter and other places, questions we've been asked, how we, whether we speak English. Sadly, I can report even my own children who are born in the United States have been asked, where are you from? So now we're, they're essentially second or third generation, and that seems to make no difference just because of their skin color. A few other final points, understanding what's happening to African American and Latinx communities and the role that plays, both in terms of structural racism and those attitudes around being afraid of PI and African American communities, viewing them, being viewed as being dishonest. The ways in which that plays into mass incarceration, I think, are important. And then finally, the structural racism components. I would say that one thing that this dialogue recently has brought to mind is questions around sort of white adjacency and ways in which Asian Americans perhaps don't necessarily have the same struggles, but yet they do have struggles under racism and white supremacy overall, and what that means. And then the very last point is around reporting. I think what we know at Stop AAPI Hate is that, in fact, the reason we've gotten so many reports and they haven't been made to law enforcement or local government agencies is those agencies don't have the trust of the community. And your data shows that very clearly. Only 30% would be willing to report something. That's partly because of language barriers, but also back to the issue of trust, which is we know from public charge, we know from immigration enforcement and other similar activities by law enforcement that the trust in the community is not there. And sadly, with Atlanta, we also see that even where there may be a definite hate crime, what happens? We have a real sort of exoneration at the microphone by law enforcement of the perpetrator, giving alternative or exculpatory explanations. No, he said it wasn't racist. He had a sex addiction. He had a bad day, right? And I will tell you, at the rally I was at in Koreatown on Saturday, a number of people said, F your bad day, because it's simply not the right way. It's not an appropriate response to what is happening to our communities. And the fact that individuals are standing up to this really heartens me and heartens us moving forward in terms of our work.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Amaju, and for all of those important points. And I just wanted to move to also this other topic that is related to what you were just speaking about, this kind of shared experience, but also distinct experiences. So one of the things that the data show are that Asian Americans, Latinx, Black Americans, Pacific Islanders, all non-white groups share a certain kind of experience and othering in the US, and yet there are some really significant differences that I don't think we can overlook. And they really dovetail with, I think, this kind of conversation we're having about, street crime is in the news, George Floyd's, the trial for George Floyd's killer is happening this week. And so I want to invite Dr. Carter to just be in conversation with me about this. And maybe we'll start with just some basic reflections, Niambi, about these data. And you're still on mute now, but I know you'll come on.
Yeah, so I want to thank you all for inviting me and for doing this work, because I think it's really important. And I think what this study highlights, because you all are talking to so many different kinds of people about the ways that people experience this exclusion and this othering, it's really important, because I think there's this sort of, conversation that people have. It's like, oh, there's shared minority status. And that there is that, but the way that people experience that status is very different. And I thought one of the things that Manju just spoke about, right, where Black people are seen as untrustworthy and have been harassed by police, or our people are afraid of them, I think is one of the ways that sort of Black people experience that exclusion. And then you have, the Asian community on the other hand, who are talking about things like people thinking of them as foreigners, or assuming they can't speak English well, or assuming that they're somehow different, right, before even speaking to them, but then fare very well in these other domains, like in housing, like in education, like in employment. And so I think it doesn't negate everyone's experience, but I think this is really useful for talking about the very different ways that all of these communities are grappling really with white supremacy. And the way that, and I like the term Manju used of white adjacency, but this way in which sort of anti-Blackness functions here, right? Where these other communities are sort of ordered, right, racially, depending on their proximity to or distance from Blackness and whiteness. And I think these are really important dynamics, because I've been really troubled about the sort of revisiting of the trope of sort of anti-Asian Black bias. And in a lot of these cases, it seems to me at least, that much of what is happening here are crimes of opportunity, perhaps crimes of proximity. Like I'm likely to be, if I am ever a victim of a crime, I hope not to be assaulted by someone who looks like me, because I live in a Black community. And that's where people tend to commit crimes, where they live or in proximity to where they live. And I'm really troubled by that, because we don't then have the same conversation on the other end, right? Where we talk about, Robert Aaron Long as an isolated incident, right? He is not part of a sort of larger sort of sense of fear that Asian people should have about whites, even though there's far more historical evidence and contemporary evidence that they are likely to be the perpetrators of the violence that those communities face. Yet the Black trope is a much easier one for people to buy into. It's one that is already sort of built in and ready-made into this sort of American system that we live in. And it troubles me, because I think it undermines the sort of work that you all are doing and that others are doing to not just bring solidarity, but to bring some real clarity to this conversation. Because when we talk about hate crimes, for example, people don't report hate crimes. There's somebody who determines that the crime that they report is a hate crime, which is another kind of problem. But then when we really dig down into the data, which is poorly collected, we know the FBI data is bad for a number of reasons. One, about who reports and what they consider to be hate crimes, right? Like some localities are saying there are no hate crimes, and we know that can't be true. But when you look at who is the victim of those crimes, more often than not, they're Black. And when you look who the perpetrators of those crimes, more often than not, they're white. And so I think that's a sort of much more difficult conversation to have than I think we would like, because one, you don't want to minimize people's experiences and the traumas that people feel. But I think it's also the case that we don't also want to sort of start this sort of narrative again. And I think, we have to just hold space for multiple things to be true at the same time. And I think that's difficult, because our racial rhetoric in this country, our racial narrative is a very flat, sort of one-dimensional one. But we know this is a far more complicated issue.
I think those are really good points. And I also think, the role of social media in the coverage, we have, one of the things we mentioned in this blog post that I just dropped in the chat too, is that the coverage of crime is heavily biased to cover Black males who are as perpetrators. And many of these crimes aren't covered. I just wanted to ask Manju, in the, someone was asking about the race of perpetrator data. And so maybe you can answer in the chat, in the Q&A there, there's some space for that. But thank you, Nyambi. And, I think this, again, the focus on real life chances is captured in this data. So, whether or not you're encouraged to pursue an education, or whether or not you face abuse by the police, I think this is an opportunity for Asian Americans to also see how, can they not be bystanders with those issues, which are endemic issues.
And I think the education one in particular is really difficult, right? Because that is an area where I think a lot of people feel like their future depends on it, right? Like no one wants to gamble with their children's future, but that's also where we see these sort of breakdowns again. So particularly in these affirmative action cases that you've written a lot about and that lots of folks have been covering, right? The sort of low-hanging fruit there is to pick on sort of Black and Latinx people and say, well, see, they're taking space or they don't deserve it. Right? No one is going after the undeserving white kids, right, who are scoring under Asian kids many times on their standardized tests. No one is making that argument. It's just these people are less smart, they're less capable, they're less deserving. And I think there's something there that we need to excavate about that, right? Because Black people become the canard for lots of kinds of things, right? And then I think, Asian Americans sometimes are used as a cudgel, because it's easy. It's like, well, this can't be racist, right? Because it's the Asian people who are bringing this lawsuit. This can't be racist. But when you look who is behind sort of orchestrating some of this, it's like, oh, they just found a different face to sort of bring cover to this racism. Because really a lot of these conversations, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I'm being
oh no, we have to be
we appreciate that so much. And we'll have a chance to circle back also, because I care about that issue a lot. I wanted to also give Drishti Pillai a chance to weigh in from NAPOF's perspective also.
Thank you, Janelle, and thank you to the AAPI data team and the SurveyMonkey team for, first of all, collecting these data. As we talked about, there is so little data out there to inform effective policymaking, and for really using these data to amplify the shared yet unique experiences in which minorities experience hate and discrimination. And at NAPOF, we focus specifically on Asian American and Pacific Islander women and girls. We try to build power among the community through legislative efforts, advocacy, grassroots movements, and these kinds of data are much needed. Two of our priorities at NAPOF in terms of data and research are the need for disaggregated data for the AAPI community and the need to look at the intersection of multiple factors, race, gender, country of origin, that play into exacerbating a lot of these these hate crimes and anti-AAPI racism experiences. So yeah, like your data showed, and I did take a deeper look on the website, there are all these disparities even within the AAPI community. There are varying rates at which hate crimes are experienced. There are different ways through which hate is experienced. For example, for Pacific Islanders, housing discrimination, they were one of the most likely minority groups to experience housing discrimination, whereas Asian Americans were one of the least likely. However, being considered a perpetual foreigner, you see Asian Americans as being highly likely. So it is really important that these data are put out there and that we keep taking a deeper look at these disaggregated numbers. And I want to really underscore the importance of intersectionality. The horrific mass shooting in Atlanta was a clear example of anti-AAPI hate intersecting with misogyny, intersecting with anti-immigrant sentiment. And it's something that I was able to see even in the data that were shared by you guys, where women, Asian American and Pacific Islander women, were 4 times more likely than AAPI women, than AAPI men, to report that gender was a reason that they experienced hate. So we really see this. The data are telling a story. We are seeing this play out in real life. That race in itself is a very important factor, but so is gender. And yeah, we are very thankful for the work that AAPI data is doing to help us understand how this is playing out and gain a nuanced understanding of the different ways in which communities are experiencing hate, the intersectional ways in which individuals might be experiencing hate. And we recognize that this is a starting place and there is a lot more work that needs to be done to disentangle all these scenarios.
Thank you so much. And there is a question in the Q&A about race of perpetrators. And even though Manjusha said that they do not collect those data through AAPI Hate. I did hear Russell Jung, who is one of the initiators of Stop AAPI Hate, did say that the majority, I'm not sure where he got those data, but he said the majority, like 90% of the perpetrators were white. So maybe whoever asked that question, it's anonymous in the chat, could follow up with Professor Jung. All right, and Laura, I just wanted to also give you a chance to talk a little bit about for a second, the resource that you just put in the chat, which is this Tableau data exploration tool.
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, first, thank you, everyone. Everything that has just been said is so enlightening, and I think part of our goal with this was to get the data out there and to get it into the hands of people like you who are experts in this topic and who can really speak to tying current events with this hard data that we're getting on this topic. So I think that's super valuable. What we tried to do, we've been working with Tableau recently to try to come up with new ways to visualize data for surveys like this. So the link that I just shared is a dashboard that we put together that pulls just a few of the questions from this survey into a group. You can spotlight different race and ethnicity breakdowns. So the starting point, the default is to spotlight the Asian American responses, but you can change that to focus on Blacks or Hispanics or whichever group you choose. And then in the top left, you can look at the data on reported hate crimes for 2020 and 2021. The top right, you can look at the numbers on that question that I think Karthik or Janelle mentioned earlier on how comfortable people feel reporting whether when they're a victim of a hate crime, or how comfortable people would feel if they had to report that sort of situation. And then the bottom section focuses on a couple of the microaggressions that we asked about in the survey, including the question that gets at that core slight of, are you actually American? Where are you really from? And then whether people have been asked to Americanize or whiten their name, whether people have had their names intentionally mispronounced. So you can filter through and play around with it. You can also break down the data to show the data within a particular racial group by gender, by income, by age, and then also for the Asian American population in particular, by those deeper subcategories, so by Southeast Asian, East Asian, and South Asian for those groups. So there's a lot of data there. I'm happy to answer any questions on that by email or any other form after this.
Thank you so much. So this is a tremendous resource. The data we presented today can be accessed again through this source that Laura just put in the chat, and it can be disaggregated both by race and by sub-national origin groups within the Asian American population, by gender, and of course, I think it's really rich to have the Pacific Islander, Native American, Native Hawaiian data also disaggregated from the Asian American data. So thank you so much again, Laura. And Karthik, did you want to add a couple more thoughts here?
Sure. Yeah, no, this has been a really fruitful conversation. We knew this when we invited our community partners and Dr. Carter to join us. So just grateful for that. A couple of things I'll say is, I saw that the White House announced some additional investments when it comes to both understanding and supporting our communities during this challenging time. There are some things in here that will require some deeper digging. So in a blog post that my colleague Jennifer Lee, professor at Columbia, and I are going to be putting out later this week, we actually find higher levels of reported experiences among the native born than the foreign born. Now, that's not what we see on constant repeat, right, in these different videos. It's not to deny the importance and the validity of all of these other things going on, but what does that look like when we think about a native born and a younger population? We find higher levels of reports, especially among those age 18 to 25. Now, what is that? How should we be thinking about that? And what can we do to make sure that we're serving all of our AAPI communities, right, by nativity, by age, and also by gender? So one of the things in Stop API Hate, in that community hotline, you see a very high proportion of women that are reporting compared to men. And what Drishti said is a point very well taken when you have the layers on top of it, that it might actually be a kind of dramatically higher level of distress that prompts people to do that. But what can we also do to make sure, to the extent that there are some of these gendered stereotypes where men don't feel like they should be reporting on some of these things, or feel uncomfortable doing so for various reasons, how can we empower all of our communities, and not just Asian American and HPI communities, but all communities of color to feel empowered and to know, I mean, some of this is systemic reform, to know that that justice will be served. I mean, that's what we all want, right? How do we make sure that that happens? So those are just my additional reflections, but really there's so much there, and we encourage our community partners as well as researchers to use that Tableau tool to dig in.
So I also just wanted to share our contact information and give each of you as panelists a chance to say a few more words. And if other questions come in through the chat, we can go ahead and answer those. So Manju, do you want to start off?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that this is really, as Karthik said, an opportunity to begin the conversation and then look at ways in which we can dive deeper. To his last point about who exactly is completing, our online form, or, versus maybe individuals who might be experiencing the hate, native born versus immigrants, individuals who identify as men versus identifying as women. I think some of these are really what we need to look at moving forward. And I think, the opportunity also, as Professor Carter stated, to really consider, what does it mean in terms of bringing our communities together with African-American and Latinx communities, because I think that wedge issue continues to be there. And I think we need to, sadly, we're going to have to continue to fight against it as a number of individuals and groups want to use it to further their own ends.
And Dr. Carter?
Thank you for that, Manju, because you were going right where I was going, right, which is how these communities are being manipulated, and talking about, I think, racial issues in these very limited ways, because in the same moment where we're talking about this rise in hate crimes, I think we also need to be thinking about voting rights, for example, right? Like those are another places to build solidarity, not just around sort of, the sort of intra-racial, interracial kinds of, or intra-minority, interracial sort of violence spaces, but there are also generative spaces, right, where we can be proactive and build community and coalition. And voting rights right now is one of those issues that's not just going to confront Black people like we see in Georgia. It's also going to matter for Native American folks in the West, in places where they predominate and where they showed up at the elections, right? It's going to matter for Latinx communities. It's going to matter for Asian communities. It matters for all of us. So I think one of the things that, while we have this moment and we can take up space and we can talk about sort of why these issues are happening and why we see these things happening, the pain and the trauma is one part of our sort of relatedness, right, in the ways that we come together, but we can also come together and unify around places where we can be proactive, where we can generate, I think, lots of possibility and new ways of being in relationship to each other. So I would encourage folks to think about more than just sort of these hate crimes issues. Also, don't be silent about police violence. Don't be silent about voting rights. Don't be silent about educational access, environmental racism, and these kind of larger structural conditions that really are going to affect all of us differently, of course, but they're going to have these sort of spillover effects. So I think there are places outside of our pain where we can also think about being in community with one another.
I agree with that, one of the things that is really lifted up here in these data are the different forms that racial bias and racism take. And you can see that, systemic racism is real, but it is not equally felt across different racial groups. And again, I think that, this moment is a call to action. Solidarity means Asian Americans really also, using kind of drawing on this experience to understand how deep racism runs in the US and doing more to stand up against systemic racism, because it's in our faces. You can't deny it looking at these data. I wanted to move to Drishti too for some additional comments.
Yeah, I had one additional comment regarding, and I just saw that there was a question posted about that as well, about Native Asian Americans being more likely to report experiencing hate than immigrants. And I think, I do think that it goes back to, and I say that as an immigrant myself, it goes back to this idea of internalizing the hate you experience, which is often higher among immigrant communities. You're not a US citizen yet, so you are even more scared, not just of reporting to authorities, but even of sharing incidents of hate with your loved ones. I have been told to go back to my country and that I don't belong here. And it's a conversation that I didn't even share with my own family, because you tend to internalize these incidents and you think it's your fault that you look a certain way or that you speak with an accent. I think, again, it calls for the need to really take a deep dive and maybe not just look at the reporting of crimes, but the perception, because the way immigrants might be perceiving an incident, it might be different from the way native borns are perceiving it. To an immigrant, being said that your English is really good for being where you're from, they may not perceive it as a hate crime until it's pointed out to them, or people mispronouncing their name. Those are experiences I've had that I've shared with other immigrants. So I really think the perception, how these incidents are perceived, whether or not they're perceived to be the more subtle ones, whether or not they're perceived to even be incidents of hate, might be very different between immigrants and US-born AAPIs.
Thank you so much. And so I'm going to just turn it over to Karthik to wrap it up, and then Laura also will actually close out our event.
Great, thank you. And I think, and to the extent that additional questions come in, we'll handle those as well. So in terms of, to what Drissy said, I mean, we found consistently over time, not only in these hate data, but experiences of discrimination and microaggressions, that the native born are more likely to name it as such, or at the very least, we observe higher rates. So I think part of that is for all of the kind of precarious status that you flagged, as well as kind of in some ways kind of making sense of something, right? As something that is unjust, not just something that is bad luck or just part of what it means to be an immigrant in America. So that's something that's quite deep.
Oh, sorry, there is a question in the chat that I just wanted to get to before, because someone asked about how the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander category was defined in terms of everyone self-identifies in these data. However, how do we categorize them? And maybe Karthik or Laura, you could speak about, how people who were Native Hawaiian, who identified as Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander and another group, how were they categorized?
Yeah, I see that, and also a question about inviting Native Hawaiian community leaders and scholars to be able to comment. So Janelle and I are in the process of doing that. This is, we got the data just a few days ago, and we do have different blog posts that are planned, and we specifically did not want to write blog posts, that with Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders as the area of focus without having members who from that community. And this is something we've remained consistent at API Data in the past, to not speak on behalf of other communities if we're not from that community as an area of focus. But it is Native Hawaiian alone and in combination in terms of how the data are derived. We had a follow-up question in terms of which racial and ethnic group did they identify with most. And so if they said Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander as that, then they would count as such. And this is true for all racial groups in the study. And I think, Laura, I hope I'm not misspeaking to say that through this partnership with SurveyMonkey is that they are thinking now about potentially changing the way that they ask their race question based on this experience with us.
Yeah, that's right. So we've been working on compiling better demographic questions across the board, so gender, race, and ethnicity for a while, and so we're currently running experiments on how to kind of optimize that. But this is definitely contributing to that research as well.
Great. Well, one final thing I wanted to say, Janelle, and this is to lift up Professor Carter's remarks. If you go to API data, and especially that 2020 pre-election survey that we did, we find, high levels of support and concern with respect to the discrimination faced by Black people. You also see consistently relatively high support that's consistent over time for affirmative action. And this really goes against that narrative that, this is not to say that, that there are of course, there are instances of intergroup tension, for example, and maybe not all feeling like we're in this together. But what we have found consistently over time is actually quite heartening. And I think part of the challenge is when it comes to the narrative, to not get so taken in by some of these images and videos that are extremely disturbing. And we need to ensure that justice is brought to bear. But how do we make sure that we also understand that much larger context, both in terms of a policy agenda, voting rights agenda, and an empowerment agenda? So I'll leave it at that. And then I think we can kick it over to Laura to help close that.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I want to thank our panelists because we're going to sign off after this, but I wanted to also, yes, thank you again to everyone for participating. And Laura, maybe have the last word and close us out today.
I mean, I will echo the thank yous. This has been a great, from start to finish, this has been, like I've said, we're super proud to be involved. This is an important topic. It may not be an uplifting topic necessarily, but thank you also to everyone who's joined us today. I hope that maybe this is an opportunity to see a little bit more of yourself represented in the data, and to feel like you are seen, your opinions matter, your experiences matter, and then when we have important data on a topic like this, there's actually steps that we can take to address these underlying problems and to come up with a bigger solution.
All right, bye everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you,
Thank you.
Janelle, for moderating.
Thank you, Janelle. Thank you, Karthik.
Thanks, everyone.